Welcome back to History and Haven, and thank you for finding your way here again tonight. Let us begin with something strange. In the quiet of an English country house, a man arrives at an idea so large it will rearrange the way every living person understands life itself. And then he does almost nothing. He writes it out in private, folds it into a drawer, shows it to 2 or 3 friends he trusts entirely, and swears them to a gentle kind of secrecy. Then he turns his attention quite deliberately to barnacles, and spends the better part of 8 years among them. The idea he set aside was not a modest one. It was the theory we now call evolution by natural selection. And the man who held his breath for 20 years, who let the most important thought of his century sit in a drawer while he counted the plates on the shells of tiny sea creatures, was a soft-spoken, frequently unwell English gentleman named Charles Darwin. If these slow walks through the past are good company for you, a like and a subscribe help this little corner of the night stay lit, only if you truly enjoy what happens here. And if you like, leave your town and your local hour in the comments. Somewhere else in the world, another sleepless person scrolls past and sees they are not the only one awake at a strange hour. So settle now. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has been holding them. Let your breathing slow, and let the hours behind you drift out of the room. Tonight we travel back into the 19th century, into the life of the man who waited, and to understand why anyone would sit for 20 years on the great discovery of his life, you have first to understand the world that made him. Charles Robert Darwin arrived on the 12th of February in the year 1809 in the town of Shrewsbury, close to the soft green border where England leans into Wales. On that same morning, 4,000 miles west across the Atlantic, in a one-room log cabin on the Kentucky frontier, a boy named Abraham Lincoln drew his first breath. It is a coincidence historians have never quite grown tired of. 2 children born under the same turning of the earth, who would each, in their own way, take the settled certainties of their century and quietly pull them apart. England in that year was a country at war. The long, grinding struggle against Napoleon still moved across Europe like weather, and it would not exhaust itself until 1815, on a muddy Belgian field near a village called Waterloo. It was a land lit by candles, where horses were the engine of everything. A journey of 100 miles took days, and news travelled no faster than a rider could carry it. There were no photographs in the world yet. No railways stitched the countryside together. The steam engine existed, but it mostly crouched at the mouths of mines, pumping out water, not yet dreaming of carrying passengers. A child born that year would grow up at the pace of a walking horse, and a sail filling slowly with wind. It was also a profoundly religious country, and that matters more to this story than anything else. Most educated English people believed, sincerely and without much strain, that the world had been created more or less as they found it. Every plant, every animal fixed since the beginning, unchanging and unchangeable. Many accepted a calculation made long before by a churchman named James Ussher, who had gathered the ages and generations recorded in Scripture, added them patiently together, and arrived at a date. The world had begun in the year 4004 before Christ. By that arithmetic, the whole of creation was not yet 6,000 years old. The hills, the seas, the lions, the sparrows on the roof tiles, all of it set down at the start and left as it was. To question this was not merely eccentric. To many people it edged toward blasphemy. Into this settled world the Darwins were comfortably placed. Not titled, owning no vast estate, but wealthy, well-regarded, and unusually well-connected. The sort of family that kept a fine house and a full staff of servants and expected its sons to enter the church, the law, or medicine. His father, Robert Darwin, was a physician with a large and thriving practice and a very large man in every other sense. Patients trusted him, his local reputation bordered on formidable. He also made shrewd investments on the side, which left the family exceptionally secure. Remember that, because money matters later. It is difficult to spend 20 years thinking about beetles and barnacles unless somebody else is paying for the coal and the candles. There was extraordinary intellectual blood in this family, and it came from both directions. Charles's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, who had died 7 years before Charles was born, had been one of the most talked about men in England. Physician, inventor, poet, friend to the engineers dragging the industrial age into being. And Erasmus had already toyed with the dangerous thought that living things might not be fixed at all, that all warm-blooded life might have unspooled from a single living filament far back in the deep past. He wrote it out in long, rolling verse. Readers found it charming and eccentric, and nobody took it seriously as science. He believed it more than he could safely say. He once had the family motto painted on his carriage, "Everything from shells," until a clergyman mocked him for it in print, and the words were quietly scrubbed away. Historians still debate whether a grandson, decades later, remembered what happens to a Darwin who says such things aloud. Either way, the idea was there, waiting on a library shelf for someone patient enough to do something more careful with it. On his mother's side, Charles came from the Wedgwoods, and that name carried a different fame. His other grandfather, Josiah Wedgwood, was the great potter who turned fine ceramics into a modern industry until Wedgwood china sat on tables across Europe. The Wedgwoods were inventive, industrious, and progressive in ways that cost them something. They threw their weight behind the abolition of the slave trade, and Josiah pressed a medallion, now famous, showing a kneeling man in chains asking whether he was not a man and a brother. That conviction ran through the family for generations. The two clans wound tightly around one another, bound by friendship and then by marriage. Charles's mother, Susanna, was a Wedgwood, and these knotted ties would shape his whole life, including, in time, the woman he married. Charles was the fifth of 6 children, a boy with several sisters and one older brother. Home was a wide, handsome house called the Mount, standing above the slow brown curve of the River Severn. His earliest years there seem to have been happy in an ordinary way, and ordinary happiness, as it often does, ended abruptly. He was 8 when his mother fell seriously ill, and in the summer of 1817 she died. In later life he said, almost apologetically, that he could remember nearly nothing of her. Not her face, not clearly. Only a few fragments that had lodged somewhere and stayed. Her sewing table, her black dress. His older sisters stepped into the gap and helped raise him, and they could be severe about it. The house was loving in its own way, but it was a place of high expectation and not much softness. So this is the picture as our story truly begins. A boy from a rich, clever, faintly unconventional family, growing up in a quiet country town, in a nation at war, inside a culture entirely certain that the natural world was finished, fixed, and a few thousand years old. Nobody looking at that boy would have guessed what was coming. He was not a brilliant student, nor ambitious in any way anyone could see, and by most measures he was an unremarkable child who preferred to be outdoors. And yet something was assembling itself inside him, a particular kind of mind, patient, watchful, gently stubborn, the sort that notices very small things and then refuses, politely and endlessly, to stop asking why they are the way they are. Shrewsbury in those years was a snug, settled place of red brick and narrow streets, wrapped inside a loop of the river, green country pressing softly in on every side. For a boy who loved to be outside, it was very close to paradise. And what he did outdoors from the very beginning was gather. That was the heart of the boy. Shells, seals, coins, pebbles, minerals. He brought them home, laid them out, and learned their names, sorting and resorting until each thing sat beside the things it resembled. Something in him needed the natural world arranged in rows. Nobody thought it meant anything. Children collect. Most of them stop. Charles never did. The habit only sharpened, growing more systematic every year, until it became the whole engine of his working life. A boy who spends his afternoons lining up beetles by the small ways they differ is, without knowing it, in training. He is learning to notice variation, learning that living things are not quite copies of one another. His formal education, meanwhile, was a quiet catastrophe. He began at a small day school in the town, and at 9 was sent to board at Shrewsbury School under a headmaster named Dr. Samuel Butler. The school stood barely a mile from the Mount, which suited Charles enormously, since he could slip home in the evenings and then sprint back through the dark before the doors were locked. He was a fast runner. He said later, half seriously, that he used to pray for speed and credited those prayers with getting him safely inside. It was the lessons that defeated him. The school taught Greek and Latin, a little ancient history and geography, and almost nothing else. Charles found no handhold anywhere in it. He had no talent for committing dead languages to memory, and worse, for a mind like his, he could see no reason why anyone should. His attention slid off the surface of the subject and fell away. Decades later, he was flat about it. As a means of education, he said, the school had been a blank to him, and he had learned absolutely nothing there. The masters judged him an ordinary boy, somewhat below the common standard in intellect. It is one of the gentle jokes of history that the unpromising boy at the back of that Latin classroom would one day be carried into Westminster Abbey and laid among the greatest minds England ever produced. There is a further curl to it. Dr. Butler's own grandson, another Samuel, grew up to be a novelist and spent much of his later life picking public quarrels with Charles Darwin about evolution. The two families circled each other across the century, unaware. What actually lit him up happened nowhere near a classroom. It happened in a garden shed. His older brother, also named Erasmus after the famous grandfather, and known in the family simply as Raz, had caught a fascination for chemistry. The two of them turned a tool house in the garden into a small working laboratory, with real apparatus, flasks and chemicals bought out of an allowance generous enough to be dangerous. There they spent hours past dark, heating and mixing and analysing, and producing, quite regularly, a tremendous stink. Charles was captivated. Here was knowledge you could hold in your hands and put to the test, where a question had an answer, and the answer could be checked. It was his first taste of doing science rather than reciting it, and the feeling never left him. Word of the nighttime experiments travelled, and the other boys gave him a nickname. They called him Gas. Dr. Butler was not amused. He hauled Charles up before the entire school and rebuked him for squandering his hours on useless subjects, for fooling about with chemicals when he ought to have been at his books. So there it is, in the 1820s, a schoolmaster informing a boy with great authority that experimenting on the substance of the world was a waste of time, and that what truly mattered was the conjugation of a Latin verb. The boy disagreed, quietly. The boy turned out to be right. Alongside the chemistry, there was shooting. In his teens, Charles fell hard for the autumn shooting season and became a genuinely fine shot. He loved the dogs, the long, cold days in the fields, the whole unhurried ritual of it. A healthy, sporting young gentleman of his class, considerably fonder of his gun and his hounds than of any book. Which brings us to his father, and to a sentence that lodged in him for 60 years. Robert Darwin was an overwhelming presence in that house, an enormous man, tall and very heavy, with a formidable memory and an instinct for reading people that made him a superb physician. Patients told him things they told no one else, but he was hard to please, and he worried about his second son. Charles seemed to be drifting, clever enough in his scattered fashion, but with no direction, no application, no sign of settling into anything a family could point to. To a man who had built his fortune out of discipline, an idle boy who cared chiefly for shooting and rat-catching was a pressing anxiety. One day it spilled over. Exasperated, his father told him he cared for nothing but shooting, dogs and rat-catching, and that he would be a disgrace to himself and to all his family. Charles was still repeating those words in his memoirs decades later, when he was among the most celebrated men alive. That tells you how far in they went. Historians still debate whether the remark was truly the wound Darwin made of it, or a flash of a tired father's temper that a guilty son polished and kept. Either way, The fear of disappointing that formidable man shaped much of what followed, perhaps, in time, some of his long silence too. A person who has been warned he might disgrace his family does not walk lightly into controversy. But Robert Darwin was not cruel, and he was not willing to let the boy drift. The obvious road for a respectable young man who had failed at the classics was medicine. There were already 2 generations of distinguished physicians in the family, the grandfather Erasmus, the father Robert. Why not a third? Charles had even gone out on rounds with him among the poorer patients of the town, and seemed to have a kind enough touch with people. So, when Charles was 16, his father decided. He pulled him out of Shrewsbury School a little early, judging quite correctly that no further good was coming of the Latin. The plan was settled. Charles would follow the family trade. In the autumn of 1825, together with Rass, who was to finish his own medical studies there, Charles was sent north to one of the finest medical schools in Britain, in the grey and learned city of Edinburgh. His father believed he was launching a future doctor. What he was in fact doing, almost by accident, was delivering a born naturalist to the one place where the true shape of his life would begin to show itself. Edinburgh that autumn was a serious city, one of the great centres of learning in Europe, all cold wind and grey stone, its medical school drawing students from across Britain and far beyond. For a young man intended for the profession, there could hardly have been a better address. Charles took lodgings with his brother, began attending the lectures, and was almost immediately miserable. The professors, most of them, droned. They read aloud from their notes until whatever life was in the subject had drained out of the room. One course on the medical uses of drugs he remembered ever after with a kind of dread, calling it as dull as the man delivering it. He had come north half hoping for the feeling of the garden shed, flasks, fumes, the pleasure of finding something out. He got a man reading paper aloud. What ended his medical career outright, though, was the operating theatre. This was the 1820s. There was no anaesthesia. Ether and chloroform lay decades in the future, and when a surgeon worked, the patient was awake, held down, and entirely aware. Charles went twice, and twice he fled before the end. One of the operations was performed on a child, and he could not bear it, not the sight, not the sounds, and he went out into the air with his heart hammering. He wrote long afterwards that the memory stayed with him for years. Whatever steel a surgeon needs, he did not have, and he knew it. Quietly, without ceremony, the family plan for a 3rd generation of Darwin physicians began to die. And yet Edinburgh was anything but wasted. Released from lessons he despised, Charles drifted toward what actually held him, and found people who fed it. He joined a student society given over to natural history, where young men read papers and argued cheerfully about the living world. And he formed a friendship that mattered enormously, with an older naturalist named Robert Grant. Grant was a strange, brilliant man, a specialist in the humblest forms of sea life, sponges, sea mats, the soft, small things that cling to rocks and are easy to walk past. He took the young Darwin under his wing. The 2 of them walked the shore of the Firth of Forth, wading into tide pools, lifting weed, carrying home whatever they found, and there Charles had his first real training in looking closely. How is this thing built? What is it doing? And why this way and not another? Grant also carried daring opinions. He admired the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who had argued openly that species were not fixed at all, that they shifted and developed across time. One day, walking, Grant broke into praise of these evolutionary ideas, and Charles listened in silence, astonished. The notion was not new to him. It had sat in his own family library for 30 years, in his grandfather's rolling verse. But to hear it stated plainly by a working scientist, in daylight, made a different kind of impression. The seed was being watered, though it would lie dormant a long while yet. Historians still debate how much of Darwin came from those shoreline walks, and whether the older man's influence was later quietly understated by the younger. There was one more teacher in Edinburgh, easily overlooked and worth remembering. Charles wanted to learn taxidermy, how to preserve a bird properly, since no naturalist could keep specimens without it. He took lessons, paid by the hour, from a man named John Edmondstone, who lodged a few doors along the same street. Edmondstone was a freed black man, born into slavery in South America, in what was then British Guyana, who had won his freedom and made his way to Scotland. He was skillful, patient, and a fine teacher, and Charles spent many hours in his company, listening to his descriptions of the tropical rainforests he had known. Years later, Darwin still spoke of him warmly. It is a quiet detail, but it hums. The man who would do more than almost anyone to argue for the deep kinship of all human beings learned one of his first useful skills from a former slave whose company he valued and remembered. After 2 years, the truth could no longer be dressed up. Charles was not going to be a doctor. His father, when he understood this, was displeased and practical. If medicine was closed, there remained a perfectly respectable road for a gentleman's son without a calling. He could take orders in the Church of England. It was a steady and comfortable life, particularly for a country parson with a private income, and it left a great deal of time for a man's own pursuits. Many of the finest naturalists in Britain were clergymen who studied beetles and wildflowers between one Sunday and the next. Charles turned it over, found no strong objection in himself, and agreed. But first he needed a degree. And so, early in 1828, he travelled south again, to the ancient courts and long lawns of Cambridge, to Christ's College. Cambridge suited him far better. He was happy there, possibly too happy. By his own cheerful confession, he wasted a great deal of time, dining well, joining a club devoted to eating unusual things, riding, shooting. Yet beneath the idleness, the old passion came roaring back, in one particular shape. Charles became obsessed with beetles, not fond of them, obsessed. He combed the hedgerows and rotting stumps around Cambridge for specimens, and prized a rare one above almost anything the world could offer. He told a story about himself that catches it perfectly. Peeling back a piece of old bark one day, he found 2 rare beetles and seized one in each hand. Then he saw a third, rarer still. Unwilling to surrender any of them, he put one beetle in his mouth to free a hand, at which point the creature discharged something so foul and burning that he spat it out at once. He lost that one. The third escaped in the confusion. A young man standing in an English wood with a live beetle in his mouth is not the dignified portrait we carry of the great Charles Darwin. But it happened, and he was rather proud of it. The real gift of Cambridge, though, was not the beetles. It was the man they led him to. The professor of botany was John Stevens Henslow, a kind, learned, unusually generous clergyman-scientist who kept open evenings at his house for any student interested in the natural world. Charles came so faithfully and asked such good questions that he became known around the university as the man who walks with Henslow. Henslow saw at once that this was no ordinary undergraduate. Behind the agreeable sporting gentleman was a real observer with a real hunger in him. He took Charles seriously, taught him to look with patience and write everything down, and introduced him to other first-rate minds, among them the geologist Adam Sedgwick, who would soon take him out into the rocks of Wales. 2 books lit a fire in him at Cambridge as well. One, an account of tropical travel by the great German explorer Alexander von Humboldt, which filled Charles with a burning wish to see distant countries and study their nature with his own eyes. He sat his final examinations early in 1831, did respectably, and prepared, in theory, to become a quiet country clergyman. He had no idea that a letter was already on its way to Henslow, a letter that would tear that gentle plan to pieces, an invitation to sail. In the late summer of 1831, Charles came home to Shrewsbury from the mountains of Wales, where Sedgwick had been teaching him to read the long story written in layers of stone. A letter was waiting for him on the hall table, and it was from Henslow. A naval ship was being prepared for a long surveying voyage around the world, its chief task to chart the coasts of South America for the British Navy. The captain, Henslow explained, wanted an educated gentleman aboard, someone with a serious interest in natural history, who could study the countries they touched at, and who could keep the captain company through what promised to be several years at sea. Henslow had been given the privilege of recommending a name, and he could think of no one better suited than his young friend Charles Darwin. There was no salary. The gentleman would in fact have to pay his own way, but for a young naturalist it was the chance of a lifetime. The very thing Humboldt's pages had made him ache for, offered to him on a single sheet of paper. Charles was beyond delighted. And then, almost at once, the door swung shut. His father said no. Robert Darwin had objections, and being a thorough man, he wrote them all down. The voyage was a wild and useless scheme. It would be dangerous. It would interrupt and very likely ruin his son's settled future in the church. It was precisely the sort of disreputable adventure that would unsettle the boy and confirm what everybody already suspected, that Charles could not stick to anything. You can hear the years of worry in it. Here was the son who had abandoned medicine, who cared for shooting and beetles, now proposing to disappear onto a small ship for years on end to look at rocks and birds on the far side of the world, instead of taking up a quiet parish. To Robert, it looked like proof of everything he had feared, but he left one narrow door ajar. If Charles could find any man of common sense who advised him to go, he said, then he would give his consent. Downcast, Charles rode over to Mayor Hall, the Wedgwood house, ostensibly to shoot and, in truth, to nurse his disappointment. And there he laid the whole matter out before his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, Uncle Jos to the family. Uncle Jos was precisely the man of common sense the situation called for. He listened to the end. Then he said he thought the voyage a splendid idea. He sat down and answered every one of Robert Darwin's objections in turn, calmly and without heat, arguing that the pursuit of natural history was an entirely proper occupation for a future clergyman, and that the experience would do his nephew a great deal of good and no harm at all. And then, rather than trust the argument to paper, he did something decisive. He put Charles in his carriage and drove the dozen miles to Shrewsbury himself to make the case to Robert face to face. Between his uncle's reasoning and his own pleading, it worked. Robert Darwin, who trusted Jos entirely, gave way, and then, with real generosity, agreed to fund the whole enterprise. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. Without one sensible uncle harnessing a carriage on a September morning, the most consequential scientific voyage in history might have sailed without Charles Darwin aboard. One hurdle remained, and it was a strange one. Charles had to be approved by the ship's captain, a young naval officer named Robert Fitzroy. Fitzroy came from grand aristocratic stock, was only a few years older than Charles, and was already an exceptional sailor. He was also proud, intense, devoutly religious, and subject to dark and sudden weather in his own mind. And he believed firmly in a fashionable notion of the day, that a person's character could be read off the shape of their head and face. When Fitzroy first met Charles, he very nearly refused him, because he did not care for the shape of Darwin's nose. He was convinced no man with such a nose could possess the energy and resolve the voyage would demand. Fortunately for science, the captain elected to overlook the offending feature, and the two of them got on rather well. So it is a plain fact of history that Charles Darwin almost did not sail around the world because a naval officer thought his nose looked idle. There was a deeper reason Fitzroy wanted a gentleman aboard, and it throws a long shadow across the whole voyage. A captain on a lengthy survey lived in something close to total isolation. The strict rules of rank meant he could not mix freely with his own officers, still less his crew. He ate alone. He decided alone. He carried every weight alone, sometimes for years without relief, and the pressure of it could be crushing. The previous captain of this same ship, on an earlier survey of those same cold southern coasts, had sunk into a deep despair and taken his own life. Fitzroy knew it intimately, and he feared the same darkness in himself, having already lost a close relative the same way. What he wanted was an educated equal, a man he could dine with, argue with, and talk to as a friend, to keep his mind steady through the long months. So Charles was engaged partly as a naturalist, and partly as ballast for a captain's soul. Historians still debate which of the two Fitzroy considered the more urgent. The vessel was called the Beagle. a small ship of the kind the Navy termed a brig, refitted for survey work. His Majesty's ship Beagle was not large. She measured under 100 feet, and into that she had to fit some 70 men, together with their provisions, instruments, and equipment for years away from any home port. Space was desperately scarce. Charles would sleep in a hammock slung in the cramped chart room, sharing the space with the great table on which the maps were drawn. There was so little room that he had to pull out a drawer at night to make somewhere for his feet. For a tall young man raised in a comfortable country house, with servants and long corridors and a river below the windows, it was a considerable adjustment. Fitzroy, meanwhile, was not sailing purely for science. He carried a private mission as well, one that tells you a great deal about the age. On his earlier voyage, he had taken aboard several native people from the cold, wind-scoured islands of Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America. He had brought them to England, dressed them in European clothes, had them taught English and the Christian religion, and presented them at court to the king and queen. Now he was carrying these Fuegians home again, along with a young missionary, hoping to plant a small Christian settlement among their people. It was an experiment in what the Victorians liked to call civilizing the savage. How that experiment ended and what Charles made of it would trouble him for the rest of his life. The departure in the meantime was delayed, and delayed again. Bad weather and last-minute preparations kept her at anchor. Twice she tried for open water, and twice the storms drove her back. At last, on the 27th of December, 1831, the Beagle stood out from Plymouth on the south coast of England and turned her bow toward the Atlantic. Charles was 22 years old. Almost at once, he discovered a cruel private fact that would follow him for the whole journey. He was appallingly seasick. Not occasionally, constantly, violently, whenever the water roughened. He would lie in his hammock, unable to eat, longing with his whole body for solid ground. The young man who had set out to study the entire living world was going to spend a great deal of the next 5 years feeling extremely unwell. And yet, in the intervals between the sickness, his eyes were about to be opened wider than he had ever thought possible. Among the books he carried into that cramped chart room was one that would shape his thinking more than almost any other. The first volume of a work called Principles of Geology by a brilliant lawyer turned geologist named Charles Lyell. Henslow had given it to him as a parting gift, along with a piece of friendly advice. "Read it for the interesting ideas," he said, "but on no account believe what it says." Charles read it. Charles believed every word. Lyell's argument was deceptively simple. The earth, he said, had not been carved by sudden catastrophes, by great floods and divine upheavals, as almost everyone assumed. It had been built up and worn down by exactly the same slow, patient forces we can watch working today. Rain shaving a hillside grain by grain, rivers carrying mud out to the sea, a volcano adding a little rock here, a coastline lifting or settling by a hair's breadth there. Nothing dramatic on any given day, nothing you would notice in a lifetime. But given time, given an almost unimaginable quantity of time, reaching back not thousands of years but many millions, those quiet processes could hollow out ocean basins and raise mountain ranges and rearrange whole continents. That was the key that opened everything. Deep time, an ocean of years so vast that slow change could accumulate into something enormous. Charles carried this idea ashore with him, and at nearly every landing along the South American coast he found it waiting for him, confirmed. Through 1832 and into 33, the Beagle worked her way down the continent, surveying as she went, her captain fussing over his 22 chronometers as he tried to fix longitude more precisely than anyone before him. Meanwhile, Charles was away for weeks at a time, riding inland on horseback and rejoining the ship far down the coast. And everywhere he looked, he saw a planet that was anything but fixed and finished. His first taste of the tropics, in the rainforests of Brazil, left him almost dizzy. The sheer abundance of it, the tangle and drip of green, the riot of insects and birds and colour, the noise at dusk, was beyond anything an English boyhood had prepared him for. He filled his notebooks with something very close to joy. But Brazil handed him something far darker as well. There he met slavery face to face, the brutal machinery on which the plantations turned. He saw the cruelty of it close up, heard what he heard, and was sickened to the bottom of himself. He came from a family of committed abolitionists, the Wedgwoods above all, with that kneeling figure pressed into pale clay, and the sight of human beings owned and beaten as property left a horror in him that never faded. It led to the worst quarrel of the entire voyage. Fitzroy, true to his conservative convictions, defended the institution and told Charles a story about a slave owner who had asked his slaves, in his own presence, whether they wished to be free, and had been told no, as though that settled the matter. Charles said the obvious thing, that no man would dare speak the truth to the person who owned him. Fitzroy erupted into one of his black rages, declared that if Charles doubted his word, they could no longer live together, and as good as put him off the ship. For a few hours, Charles believed the voyage was finished for him, but the captain's storms blew through as quickly as they arrived, and before the day was out, an apology came and an invitation to dine. The friendship held. But both men now understood there were subjects on which they would never meet. Historians still debate how close that afternoon came to ending the voyage altogether. Further south, on the bleak, scoured plains of Patagonia, Charles made the discoveries that began to trouble him at a deeper level. In the cliffs and gravel beds he found bones, enormous fossil bones, the remains of vast creatures that no longer walked anywhere on Earth. There was Megatherium, a ground sloth the size of an elephant. There was a strange heavy beast he called Toxodon, as large as a rhinoceros. There were Glyptodons, armoured animals carrying great domed shells of bone, like the roofs of small buildings. And these bones asked him a question he could not put down. The giant armoured creature looked, for all its monstrous size, remarkably like the small armadillos still scuttling across those very same plains. The huge ground sloth had obvious cousins among the living sloths of South America. Why should the extinct giants of this one land so closely resemble the living animals of that same land and of nowhere else on Earth? If every species had been separately made and fixed forever, the pattern made no sense at all. Why would a creator remove a giant armadillo and set a small one down in precisely the same place? It looked far more as though the living animals were somehow descended from the vanished ones, altered, reduced, worn down by the ages, but still carrying the family likeness in the bones. Charles did not leap. He was far too cautious a man for leaping, but the question lodged in him like a splinter, and it never worked its way out. And then came the day that turned Lyell's quiet theory violent and immediate. In February of 1835, while the Beagle lay off the coast of Chile, an immense earthquake struck near the town of Concepcion. Charles happened to be ashore, lying resting in a wood, when the ground began to roll and heave beneath him. He wrote afterwards of the strange, sickening sensation of solid earth moving like liquid, and of how thoroughly it shook his sense of what in this world could be relied upon to stay still. When he reached the town, he saw the ruin of it, but he also saw something that stopped a geologist's breath. Along the shore, beds of mussels and other shellfish that had spent their lives underwater were now sitting high and dry above the waterline. In a matter of minutes, the land itself had been lifted several feet out of the sea. Here was the whole of Lyell's argument, made flesh in a single afternoon. The land was not fixed. The land rose. And if one afternoon's shaking could lift a coastline by a few feet, then countless such afternoons, spread across millions of years, could hoist an entire mountain range into the sky. That thought took hold of him completely when he climbed high into the Andes and found, embedded in stone thousands of feet above the nearest water, the fossilized shells of sea creatures and the remains of ancient trees that had once stood on a shoreline. The roof of South America had once been the floor of an ocean. The whole colossal landscape had been heaved upward, unhurriedly, across an abyss of years. After standing in that thin, cold air with a seashell in his hand, Charles could never again think of the earth as young or stable or finished. On those long inland rides, he studied the living world too, and the people in it. He rode for days with the gauchos, the half-wild horsemen of the southern plains, admiring their skill with the lasso and the hard freedom of their lives, while recording, with a heavy pen, the grim war being waged against the native peoples of the interior. And he noticed something about a bird. A large, flightless creature called the rhea, a cousin of the ostrich, came in two distinct forms, a bigger northern kind and a smaller southern kind, their territories meeting and overlapping in a way that made no obvious sense. At the time, he set it down as an interesting puzzle and nothing more. Like the fossils, it was another piece of a pattern he could not yet name. By the time the Beagle prepared to leave the mainland and turn west into the Pacific, the man aboard her was no longer the amiable gentleman amateur who had climbed the gangplank at Plymouth. He had become a serious and confident scientist. Crates of specimens and notebooks, thick with careful observation, were already crossing the Atlantic ahead of him, where Henslow was quietly building his former student a reputation among men Charles had never met. And his mind was loaded now, with fossils, with rheas, with the stubborn question of why the life of one place should so resemble the life that had come before it in that same place. The next stop would press on those questions harder than anything yet. The ship was bound for a small, dry, forbidding cluster of volcanic islands sitting on the equator, the Galapagos. They arrived in September of 1835, and the islands were no paradise to look at. Young volcanic rock, black and broken, stunted grey bushes, a harsh, dry heat, 600 miles of empty ocean between them and the South American coast. Charles said the place looked rather like the world might look after a great fire, all cinders and lava. Yet these grim little islands would become the most famous stop of the whole voyage, and the place bound forever to his name. What made them extraordinary was the life on them. The animals were entirely unafraid. Birds would settle on a person's hat and could be picked up by hand. Having evolved with no large predators, they had never learned that a human being was anything to worry about, and Charles walked among them like a visitor to a world that had not yet been taught caution. There were great black marine iguanas, ungainly lizards that swam out into the surf to feed on seaweed and exist nowhere else on Earth. There were land iguanas, sea lions, seabirds in uncountable numbers, and above all, there were the tortoises, the giant tortoises that gave the islands their name, from an old Spanish word, Galapago. They were enormous and ancient, some so heavy 2 men could barely shift one. Charles amused himself by climbing onto their backs and riding a little way, finding it surprisingly hard to stay upright as they lumbered on beneath him. He timed their plodding pace and watched them haul themselves up the slopes to the few freshwater springs to drink. And it was here that the islands first whispered their secret, though the one who whispered it was not Charles. It was the acting governor of the small penal colony on one of the islands, an Englishman named Nicholas Lawson. Lawson remarked, almost in passing, that he could tell at a glance which island any tortoise had come from, simply by the shape of its shell. One island produced shells of one form, another island a different form, and so on down the archipelago. Charles heard it, and did not grasp what he was holding. He was busy, distracted, not yet thinking along the lines that would have made the remark detonate. He filed it away. The same thing happened with the birds. He noticed the mockingbirds differed from island to island, and to his credit, he kept those separate and labelled which island each had come from. But there was another group of small, dull, brownish birds that he gathered more carelessly. They showed a curious range of beaks, some thick and heavy, some fine and narrow, and he assumed at the time that they were a mixed assortment of different sorts of bird altogether. He did not record which island each one came from. He simply could not see why it would matter. This is the most important truth about the whole Galapagos story, and it is almost always told wrong. Charles Darwin did not stand on that black rock and suddenly understand evolution. Nothing struck him. The famous insight arrived later, slowly, in England, when an expert opened his boxes and told him what he had actually brought home. Historians still debate whether the islands mattered as much as the fossil beds of Patagonia, or whether the Galapagos have simply told the better story. There is a small, awkward fact that captures his state of mind exactly. As the Beagle left the islands, the crew loaded dozens of the giant tortoises aboard, not as scientific specimens, but as fresh meat for the Pacific crossing. Over the following weeks, they ate their way steadily through them and threw the empty shells over the side. Charles, the great naturalist, joined in with everyone else. So some of the very creatures that would become the most celebrated evidence in the history of biology were eaten for dinner and tipped into the sea, their origins lost for good. He came to regret that carelessness deeply. He was rescued in part by other people's tidiness. Fitzroy and the ship's servants had made their own bird collections, properly labelled, and years later those labels would help repair what Darwin had failed to write down. From the Galapagos, the Beagle turned west across the wide Pacific. The surveying was largely finished now, and the voyage became a long homeward loop around the world. They called at Green Tahiti, where Charles admired both the landscape and the work of the missionaries. Then New Zealand. Then the young British colony in Australia, and Australia gave him fresh trouble to chew on. There he met animals found nowhere else on Earth, the kangaroos and the other pouched creatures, and strangest of all, the platypus, a furred animal that lays eggs. Sitting beside a creek one afternoon, watching those improbable creatures paddle and dive, Charles wrote something striking into his diary. An unbeliever, he mused, looking at animals so unlike anything else in the world, and yet so perfectly fitted to their own strange country, might well conclude that two separate creators had been at work. It was heresy, and he knew it, and he was only playing. But the playing was getting bolder. It was in the Indian Ocean, among the low coral rings of the Cocos or Keeling Islands, that he produced the first great original theory of his career, and it had nothing to do with animals at all. He had become fascinated by coral reefs, those circular walls of living coral that enclose a still lagoon which sailors called atolls. How did such a thing come to be? The reef was built by tiny coral animals that can only live in shallow, sunlit water near the surface. Yet these rings often rose out of water far too deep for coral ever to have begun growing there. Charles worked out the answer, and the answer is beautiful. Picture an island with a reef fringing its shore. Now let the land sink, very slowly, over an enormous span of time, exactly the sort of patient movement Lyell had taught him to believe in. As the land goes down, the living coral keeps building upward toward the light, generation upon generation, resting on the skeletons of its ancestors. Eventually, the central island slips away altogether beneath the surface, and all that remains is a ring of reef standing where the island used to be, holding a lagoon in its arms. The whole structure was the record of an island quietly drowning across the ages, written in living stone. The lovely detail is that he reasoned it out before he had ever seen an atoll, worked out on the South American coast, and only then confirmed with his own eyes. When he published it, even the cautious Lyell was delighted. By now, Charles had been at sea for nearly 5 years, and he wanted, badly, to go home. He was tired of the endless motion, tired of being sick, tired of the distance between himself and everyone he loved. What he did not fully understand was that the crates he had been shipping back had already made him a name. Henslow had printed and circulated some of his geological letters among the right people, so that a reputation was standing on the dock waiting for him. The Beagle crossed the Atlantic one final time, touching again at South America to complete some last measurements, an agony for a man whose whole body was pointed toward England. And then, at last, on the 2nd of October, 1836, she dropped anchor at Falmouth. It was a dark, wet night. Charles waited for nothing. He gathered his things, stepped off the ship that had been his cramped and seasick home for almost 5 years, and took the first coach he could find toward Shrewsbury. He had left as a drifting young man his father feared might become a disgrace. He came back a serious scientist, carrying a head full of dangerous questions. The voyage was over. The real work was only beginning. He reached the house very early in the morning, before anyone was stirring. Rather than wake the household, he let himself in quietly, waited, and walked in on his father and sisters at breakfast. The reunion was joyful. Robert Darwin, who had once been so certain this son would come to nothing, looked at the composed and capable man across the table, and is said to have turned to his daughters and remarked that the very shape of Charles's head had altered. The aimless boy was gone. The old anxiety went with him. But Charles did not rest. He was bursting with work. 5 years at sea had filled crate after crate, plants, animals, fossils, rocks, skins, thousands of specimens, and every one of them now needed to be sorted, described, and put in front of someone who could say what it was. So he moved to London, the centre of British scientific life, took rooms, and began distributing his collections among the specialists. He had neither the time nor the training to classify every bone and every bird himself. He handed them out and waited for the answers to come back. And this is how the great revelation finally reached him. Not on a tropical shore, under a hot equatorial sky. In a London study, second-hand, out of another man's mouth. The Galapagos birds went to a gifted ornithologist named John Gould, among the finest in the country. In the early months of 1837, Gould examined the small, dull brown birds Charles had gathered so carelessly. The ones he had assumed were an assortment of blackbirds and finches and wrens, and delivered a verdict that knocked the ground out from under him. They were not an assortment at all. Every single one of them was a finch, closely related finches. 12 or more distinct species found nowhere else on Earth, differing chiefly in the size and shape of their beaks. And the mockingbirds from the different islands were not local varieties either. They were separate species too. It landed on Charles like a clap of thunder. Distinct species, on separate islands, within one small, isolated cluster of rock, all plainly related to one another, and related in turn to the birds of the South American mainland from which the islands could once have been reached. It looked precisely as though a single kind of bird had blown out there long ago, and then, split up and shut away on different islands under different conditions, had gradually divided and altered into many forms, each shaped to its own way of making a living. What the tortoise shells had murmured and the mockingbirds had hinted, the finches now said out loud, and here his own carelessness came back for him. He had not recorded which finch came from which island. He had to scramble to rebuild the information from the tidier notes of others aboard the ship, including, with some irony, Captain Fitzroy. Historians still debate whether Gould's verdict truly converted him in that moment, or merely confirmed something that had been assembling in him since Patagonia. Either way, in July of 1837, alone in his study, Charles did something quietly momentous. He opened a new notebook, the first of several he would fill, and began setting down his private thoughts on what he called the transmutation of species, the changing of one kind of living thing into another across time. And on one page he drew a simple branching diagram, one trunk, and from it a splitting, and from each split another splitting, a small crooked tree showing how a single ancestral form might divide and divide again into many descendants. Above it he wrote 2 cautious words, I think. With that private little tree drawn in ink on a page nobody was meant to see, the theory of common descent was truly born. And there it stayed, locked in the notebooks, shown to no one. He understood exactly how much powder he was holding. Meanwhile, his public life flourished. He was elected to the important scientific societies, served as a secretary of the Geological Society, and moved among the leading minds of the day, including Lyell himself, who became a friend and an ally. He worked hard on his account of the voyage, a lively, readable book full of everything he had seen, and when it appeared in 1839, it was genuinely popular, carrying his name well beyond scientific circles. He was a rising star, busy, productive, and increasingly worn out. Around this same time, he turned that careful, list-making mind of his onto an entirely different problem, whether he ought to marry, and he did it in a way that is almost comically his own. He took a sheet of paper, ruled a line down the middle, and set out the case on both sides, weighing it like any other question of evidence. Against, The loss of freedom, the expense, the anxiety, the hours stolen from his work. In favour, a constant companion, a friend for old age, someone to love and be cared for by. And he concluded, in a phrase that has followed him ever since, that a wife would be at the very least better than a dog. Having reasoned his way to the bottom of the page, he wrote there that he should marry, and marry soon. The woman he chose was already close at hand. She was his own first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, youngest daughter of his beloved Uncle Jos, the very man who had harnessed a carriage and argued him onto the Beagle. Charles and Emma had known one another all their lives. She was warm, well-read, quick-minded, a fine pianist, and a sincerely religious woman with a real and settled Christian faith. They married on the 29th of January, 1839, in a quiet ceremony. By every surviving account, it was a devoted marriage, and it lasted the rest of his life. But it carried a tenderness of sorrow inside it, and the sorrow came from the very ideas he was building in secret. Emma's faith mattered to her, deeply, and she understood that her husband's mind was drifting away from the beliefs they had both been raised in. She worried about him, honestly, lovingly, and about the dreadful possibility that his doubts might part them in an afterlife she believed in, and he was coming to question. She wrote him gentle, anxious letters about it. He kept them. At the bottom of one, years afterwards, he wrote that he had cried over it. They never resolved the difference. They simply carried it, together with extraordinary kindness, each leaving room for the other, and it never once broke the bond between them. There was a second quiet worry they shared too in later years, that being first cousins might have cost their children something in health. Charles turned that fear over for the rest of his life. The couple set up house in London first, but two things soon pushed them out of the city. The first was his health, which had begun a long and mysterious decline. He suffered bouts of severe sickness, stomach trouble, headaches, palpitations, a bone-deep exhaustion that would trouble him for the rest of his days, and that the doctors of the age could neither explain nor mend. The cause is still argued over. Some suspect an illness picked up in the tropics, others a nervous condition, perhaps sharpened by the strain of nursing a dangerous secret. Whatever it was, it left him craving quiet, rest, and an unvarying routine. The second reason was simpler. He wanted peace to think, and somewhere to raise a family away from the noise of the city. So in the autumn of 1842, Charles and Emma bought a large, plain, comfortable old house in the small village of Down in Kent, in the countryside southeast of London. It was called Down House. It had grounds and gardens and quiet lanes, and it stood far enough out to feel like a retreat, yet near enough to keep in touch with the scientific world by letter and the occasional visitor. Here, in that gentle and orderly house, among his gardens and his growing children, Charles Darwin would spend the remaining 40 years of his life. He would rarely travel far again, and here, in deep and deliberate secrecy, he would slowly assemble the case for the most disruptive idea of the century. The great puzzle that remained was no longer whether species changed. He was privately certain now that they did. The puzzle was how. What was the actual force? What shaped a finch's beak or drew out the neck of a giraffe? Earlier thinkers, his own grandfather among them, and the Frenchman Lamarck, had suggested that creatures change through effort and habit, that an animal reaches toward what it needs and passes the gains it makes to its young. Charles found this unconvincing. He wanted a mechanism that could work by itself, blindly, without purpose, without anything striving toward anything. The answer arrived from an unlikely direction, a gloomy book about human poverty. In the autumn of 1838, for what he later described as amusement, Charles read an essay on population by an English clergyman and economist named Thomas Malthus. Malthus argued that human numbers always tend to grow faster than the food supply that has to feed them. More children are born than the world can support, and so a struggle is unavoidable. Famine, disease, and competition trimming the numbers back down. It was a bleak vision. But as Charles read it, something caught and lit. The same brutal arithmetic ran through the whole of nature, only far more harshly. Every plant and every animal produces vastly more offspring than can possibly survive. A single fish lays thousands of eggs. A plant scatters countless seeds. Yet the world is not buried in fish or seedlings because nearly all of them die before they can reproduce. There is a constant, silent struggle simply to exist, far more born, always, than there is room or food to keep. And now Charles added the second piece. It was a thing he had been noticing all his life, ever since he lined up beetles on a table in Shrewsbury. Within any species, no two individuals are exactly alike. They vary. One is a little faster, one is a little stronger or better hidden against the bark, or slightly better at finding food or slipping away from danger. Put those two facts side by side and the conclusion falls out on its own. In the struggle to live, the individuals carrying some slight advantage are, on average, a little more likely to survive and to leave young behind them. Those slightly less suited are a little more likely to die before they breed. And because offspring tend to inherit what their parents were, the helpful differences get passed along and spread slowly through the population, while the unhelpful ones quietly disappear. Across enormous spans of time, this endless sorting, this preserving of the useful and weeding out of the useless, could remake a species entirely. And where a population was cut off from its relations, it could split one species into several. He called the force natural selection. There was no designer standing behind it. There was no destination it was travelling toward. It was simply what must happen, given variation, inheritance, and more lives beginning than the world has room for. It was, in its way, terribly simple, and that simplicity was part of what made it so unsettling. By 1842, he felt sure enough to write the theory out. A short sketch, 35 pages in pencil. 2 years later, he expanded it into a fuller essay running well past 200 pages. And then he did something that tells you exactly how he regarded what he was holding. He did not publish it. Instead, he wrote a solemn letter to Emma, to be opened only if he died, instructing her to have the essay properly edited and brought out. He set aside money for the purpose. He named the men who might be trusted to help. He treated his own discovery as a dangerous secret to be released from beyond the grave. Here was a man who believed he had found something true and important, and who was so afraid of the weather it would bring that he arranged for it to appear only once he was safely out of reach. His fear was not foolish. That very same year, 1844, a book appeared anonymously under the title Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, arguing in a loose and popular way that the universe and all its life had developed by natural progress rather than separate acts of creation. The public devoured it. The scientific and religious establishment fell upon it like wolves, mocking its errors and condemning its impiety. Charles watched that savaging very carefully, and it taught him a lesson he never forgot. To advance such ideas without overwhelming, unanswerable evidence was to invite ruin. He resolved that when he finally spoke, his case would be so thorough, so densely packed with fact, that it could not simply be laughed away. Which led him into one of the strangest detours in the history of science. To establish himself past all doubt as a rigorous working biologist, and not merely a man with a theory, he decided to make a complete study of one humble group of creatures. He chose barnacles, the small shelled animals that crust the rocks and foul the hulls of ships. He had picked up an odd one on the voyage years before, and never quite stopped wondering about it. That wondering swallowed 8 years of his life. From 1846 to 1854, he dissected, classified, and described them in exhausting detail, producing several thick, scholarly volumes that earned him the genuine respect of naturalists everywhere, and eventually a medal from the Royal Society. The work mattered. It taught him more about how living things vary than any other project could have, but 8 years is a very long time to spend among barnacles when the secret of life is lying folded in your desk drawer. Historians still debate what the delay really was, fear of the storm, or simply the enormous patience of a man who would not speak before he was ready. The barnacles became so much a fixture of that house that they passed into family legend. One of his small sons, visiting a friend, is said to have looked at the boy's father and asked, in perfect innocence, where he did his barnacles. The child had assumed that studying barnacles was something all fathers did, since his own had done little else for as long as he could remember. It is a warm little picture of that busy home, children everywhere, and the great scientist bent over his microscope, year after year after year. But that house held deep sorrow as well. Charles and Emma had 10 children in all, of whom 7 grew up, and by the standards of stern Victorian fatherhood, he was remarkably tender and playful with them. Then, in 1851, came a blow he never entirely recovered from. His eldest daughter, Annie, bright, affectionate, 10 years old, and the child he loved most, fell gravely ill, and after a long decline, died. Charles was shattered. He had nursed her through her last days. A week afterwards, he sat down and wrote a private memorial of her, only for himself and Emma, remembering the way she moved and spoke and the particular sweetness of her nature. Whatever remained of his belief in a watchful and benevolent God went out of him with her. He could not fit the suffering of an innocent child into a picture of a loving Creator attending to every detail of the world. After Annie, by most accounts, his drift away from Christian faith was complete, though he kept it largely to himself, out of love for Emma and out of respect for other people's feelings. He never wished to be seen as an enemy of religion. He simply, quietly, stopped believing. Through all of it, his health stayed poor, and life at Down House settled into a strict, gentle routine built around managing it. He worked in short bursts in the morning, rested, ate at fixed hours, and every day walked a gravel path he had laid out at the edge of the grounds, a quiet loop among the trees the family called the sand walk. He would pace it slowly, turning a problem over, counting his circuits by kicking aside small stones he had piled at the start. It was on that plain path, more than at any desk, that he did his deepest thinking. By the middle of the 1850s, the theory was finished in his mind and drafted on paper. Lyell, sensing what it was and fearing that someone else might arrive at the same place, pressed him to write it up properly and publish it. And so, in 1856, Charles at last began work on what he called his big book. It was to be a vast, exhaustive treatment of the entire subject, and he approached it the way he approached everything, slowly, carefully, with no sense of hurry at all, quite certain that he had all the time in the world. He was wrong. On the far side of the planet, in the heat of a Southeast Asian jungle, a young naturalist was arriving at the very same idea, and was about to fold it into an envelope addressed to Charles Darwin. But before that envelope reaches Kent, it is worth stepping out of the quiet study and looking around at the world outside its windows, because that world explains why one modest book would land like an artillery shell. The 1850s were the heart of what we now call the Victorian Age, named for the young queen who had come to the throne in 1837 and would reign for more than 60 years. Britain in those decades stood at the summit of its power and its self-belief. It governed an empire spread across the globe. Its factories had made it the workshop of the world, and its comfortable classes were entirely convinced that they were living in an age of progress, improvement, and order. The country had been remade since the candle-lit, horse-drawn world into which Charles had been born. Railways now stitched the land together, carrying people and goods at speeds that would have seemed like sorcery to his grandfather. The electric telegraph could throw a message hundreds of miles in moments, and in 1851, the nation held an enormous celebration of its own cleverness, the Great Exhibition, housed in a shimmering hall of iron and glass they called the Crystal Palace, where millions came to walk among the machines and marvels of the modern age. It was a society persuaded that knowledge and industry were carrying mankind steadily upward. It was also a society sliced neatly by class, and everyone knew precisely where they stood in it. At the top, the aristocracy and the landed gentry, the old families with the great estates and inherited titles. Below them, growing fast in numbers and in confidence, the middle class. Bankers, factory owners, merchants, lawyers, physicians, clergymen. This was Darwin's own world, the prosperous professional families who kept fine houses and servants and prized respectability above nearly everything else. And beneath them all, the great mass of working people, labourers, factory hands, miners, farm workers, servants, together with the desperately poor of the crowded industrial cities, living hard, short lives in conditions the comfortable classes preferred not to picture too clearly. You could read a person's rank in a glance from their clothes alone. A gentleman went about in dark, formal tailoring, the long frock coat, the buttoned waistcoat, narrow trousers, and on his head the tall silk top hat that has become the very emblem of the century. A respectable lady wore layer upon layer over a tightly laced corset, and in this particular decade, an immense bell-shaped skirt held out by a cage of hoops called a crinoline, so wide that doorways became a real negotiation. Bonnets, gloves, shawls completed her. To appear in public improperly dressed was simply unthinkable. The working poor, meanwhile, wore plain, sturdy cloth, mended and mended again, made to be worked in, with a flat cap or a simple shawl where the silk hat and the bonnet would have been. The same line ran straight through the dinner table. A wealthy family dined in state, moving through course after course, soups, fish, roasted meats, game birds, rich puddings, imported fruit, wine throughout, and afterwards the tea the British now drank in astonishing quantities, sweetened with sugar carried in from across the empire. A comfortable middle-class household ate well too, with meat at the centre of the main meal. But for the labouring poor, the daily reality was bread and potatoes, a little cheese, weak tea, and meat rarely, if ever. What a person ate, like what they wore, announced their place in the order of things, and that order was widely held to be natural, proper, and ordained. Ordained is the important word, because above all this was a deeply religious society, and respectability and faith were braided tightly together. The Church of England sat at the centre of national life. Sunday was kept strictly, church attendance, quiet conduct, no frivolous amusements. Most people treated the Bible as the literal and authoritative word of God, and its account of creation was simply assumed to be so. Historians still debate how uniformly literal that belief really was, and how many educated Victorians privately held looser views than they voiced on a Sunday. Underpinning the educated faith of the age was a comforting idea called natural theology, made famous by a clergyman named William Paley. Paley had offered an image that everybody remembered. Suppose you found a watch lying on the ground. Its intricate workings would compel you to conclude that some skilled watchmaker had designed and assembled it. In precisely the same way, he argued, the astonishing craftsmanship of living things, the eye, the wing, the exact fitting of every part to its purpose, proved beyond argument the existence of a divine designer who had made them all deliberately and with care. Darwin had studied Paley closely at Cambridge and had once found the argument entirely convincing. His whole theory was, in effect, a quiet substitution. Take away the watchmaker. Put in his place a blind, automatic process that requires no intention, no foresight, and no maker at all. You can see why he expected trouble. Science itself was shifting in these years, moving out of the drawing room and toward a profession. For most of history, the study of nature had been the pastime of wealthy amateurs and curious clergymen, men with private incomes and time on their hands, which is exactly the world Darwin belonged to. Here is a small sign of how new the modern idea of science still was. The word scientist had only just been invented, coined in the 1830s by a Cambridge scholar named William Whewell, because there existed as yet no proper name for a person who studied the natural world in this systematic way. Before that, they had called themselves natural philosophers. Many disliked the new word and refused it for decades. The professional scientist, a figure we now take entirely for granted, was so young a thing that it had barely been given a name within Darwin's own lifetime. And yet, beneath all that surface confidence, cracks were already opening in the comfortable marriage of science and scripture. Geology, the very subject that had so thrilled Charles among the rocks of Wales and the cliffs of Patagonia, had been quietly making trouble for years. The rocks had been telling a story for decades now, and it was not the story in the book. They spoke of an Earth unimaginably old, far older than the few thousand years a literal reading allowed, and crowded with strange, extinct creatures that had lived and died long before any human being drew breath. Thoughtful religious people had found ways to make their peace with this, loosening their reading of Scripture to admit the long ages of stone. But something had shifted. The easy certainty that the natural world matched the written word in every particular was gone. The ground beneath the old beliefs was already a little softer than it had been. That was the world surrounding the quiet house in Kent. A proud, powerful, sharply layered society, confident in its progress, devoted to its church, and resting its whole understanding of life on the comfortable conviction that every creature had been designed and set in place by a loving God, each in its fixed station, much as every person seemed to occupy a fixed station in the social order. To such a world, the suggestion that all living things, human beings very much included, had arisen out of a blind and undirected struggle, with no designer, no plan, and no special seat reserved for mankind, was not simply a scientific claim. It went at the foundations on which respectable Victorian life was built. Darwin understood this in his bones. It is why he had waited so long, gathered so much, and written instructions for his theory to appear only once he was beyond the reach of the argument. He was not merely protecting his reputation. He genuinely dreaded the upheaval he believed his idea would bring, and he had hoped, perhaps, to be spared the worst of it. That hope was about to be taken away from him by a single letter. The man who shattered Darwin's leisurely pace was almost his opposite in every particular. His name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and he was 14 years the younger. Where Charles was a wealthy gentleman who could afford to think for 20 years at his own speed in a comfortable house, Wallace had no money at all and earned his living with his hands and his eyes. He came from a modest family, had little formal schooling, and had taught himself natural history out of nothing but appetite. To support himself, he became a professional collector, travelling to the tropics to gather rare birds, insects, and skins, shipping them home to be sold to museums and wealthy men with cabinets. It was hard, precarious work. On one voyage home, his ship caught fire and sank, taking years of collections with it and leaving him 10 days in an open boat. But it put him out in the wild places of the world with sharp and hungry eyes. By the 1850s, he was working his way through the Malay archipelago, the great chain of islands that today makes up Indonesia and Malaysia, collecting by day and, in the hours between, turning over exactly the questions that haunted the man in Kent. How do new species come to be? Why should the animals of one island differ from those of the next, a few miles of water away? He had read about populations and the struggle to survive, including that same essay by Malthus that had struck Charles years before, and the ideas were working in him. In February of 1858, Wallace lay ill on the island of Ternate, shaking with the fever and chill of malaria. And there, drifting in and out of feverish thought, the whole answer assembled itself in his mind at once. The endless production of young, the constant struggle, the survival of those best fitted to their conditions, and, following from all of it, the slow transformation of species. It was, in its essentials, precisely the theory Charles Darwin had been quietly building for 2 decades. As soon as the fever loosened enough to let him hold a pen, Wallace set it down in a short, clear essay, and then he did the thing that changed Darwin's life in an instant. He knew of Darwin as a respected senior naturalist with an interest in the species question, and the two had exchanged a few friendly letters. So Wallace folded his essay into an envelope and posted it to Down House, asking Darwin, if he thought the work had any merit, to pass it on to the great Charles Lyell. He had no idea, None whatsoever that the older man he was writing to had already worked the whole thing out and was sitting on hundreds of pages about it. The letter reached Kent in June of 1858. Historians still argue over exactly when it arrived, and a few have wondered aloud whether Darwin held it longer than he admitted. Most conclude the delay is better explained by the ordinary slowness of colonial mail. When Charles opened it and read, he was stunned into something close to despair. Here, written by a stranger in a single feverish burst, was his own theory, the labour of half a lifetime, nursed in secret, buttressed with mountains of evidence. He wrote at once to Lyell in real anguish, saying he had never seen a more striking coincidence, and that if Wallace had somehow held his own draft from 14 years earlier, he could not have produced a better summary of it. All those years of priority, his claim to have got there first, were about to evaporate. If he rushed his own work into print now, he would look as though he had lifted the idea from Wallace, or at best treated a trusting younger man shabbily. If he stayed silent and let Wallace publish, he would lose the credit for a lifetime's work. He was caught between his ambition and his honour, and the strain of it was terrible. And then it became far worse, because as the crisis broke, sorrow came into the house again. Scarlet fever was moving through the village, and it reached the Darwins' youngest child, a baby boy named Charles Waring, not yet 2 years old and always frail. In late June, in the very middle of the agony over Wallace's letter, the little boy died. Charles and Emma were plunged back into grief, and for a few days the great scientific question must have seemed very far away indeed, while a family buried another child. It fell to Darwin's two closest friends in science to find a way through the tangle. Charles Lyell, the geologist, and Joseph Dalton Hooker, a brilliant botanist who had become his most trusted confidant, took the whole matter into their own hands. They devised a solution they believed fair to both men. Rather than let either Darwin or Wallace claim the idea alone, they would present the two of them together, side by side, as joint discoverers. They gathered extracts from Darwin's own writings, portions of the unpublished essay of 1844, and a letter setting out his theory that he had written to an American colleague the previous year, which proved beyond dispute that he had held the idea long before anything arrived from Ternate. These they laid alongside Wallace's fresh essay, and arranged for all of it to be read out at a meeting of one of London's learned societies. And so, on the 1st of July 1858, at a meeting of the Linnean Society of London, the joint work of Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace was placed before the scientific world for the first time. Neither man was in the room. Wallace was still thousands of miles away among the islands, and knew nothing of what was being done in his name until long afterwards. Darwin was at home in Kent, grieving, in no condition to attend, having just buried an infant son. The theory that would rearrange humanity's understanding of itself entered history by way of two friends reading papers aloud to a mildly attentive audience, with both authors absent. And here is the strangest part. Nothing happened. There was no uproar, no excitement, no sense in the room that anything of consequence had occurred. The members listened politely, and the meeting moved along to the next item. The idea that would shortly shake both science and religion to their footings slipped into the world almost without being noticed. The proof of how little impression it made came at the end of that year, when the president of that very society summed up the preceding 12 months by observing that the year had not been marked by any of those striking discoveries which revolutionize a branch of science. He had personally presided over the announcement of one of the most revolutionary ideas in the history of biology, and concluded that nothing much had happened. It is a fine reminder that people living through the hinge of history very often have no notion at all that they are doing so. There remained the question of how Wallace would take it when the news finally reached him. His response did him enormous credit. Far from feeling robbed, the younger man was delighted and honoured to have his name set beside Darwin's, and to have his work carried before the world by such distinguished figures. He never once complained of unfairness. For the rest of his long life, he remained a generous admirer of Darwin, content to let the older man hold the larger share of the fame, and years later he wrote a book of his own about the theory and titled it, without apparent irony, Darwinism. It was an act of grace not every man would have managed. Historians still debate whether the arrangement was truly fair to him, or whether two well-placed friends quietly secured the priority of a third. The quiet reception changed nothing about Darwin's position in one crucial respect. He had to publish, and he had to do it fast, before someone else filled in the outline first. So the enormous big book was abandoned. In its place, he would write a shorter version, what he modestly called an abstract of his argument. He set to work that summer, ill and grieving, and wrote faster and with more concentration than at any point in his life. Through the second half of 1858 and on into 59, Charles wrote as he never had before. The unhurried man who had given 8 years to barnacles and 20 to circling his own theory was simply gone. In his place sat an author racing the clock, tired, unwell, working in the short daily bursts his body permitted, but working with total focus, compressing the vast material of the abandoned book into something tighter and far more readable. It cost him dearly in headaches and stomach trouble. He kept at it anyway. By the autumn of 1859, the manuscript was finished and in the hands of his publisher, a respected London firm run by John Murray. There is a lovely detail from that stage. Murray sent the manuscript to a reader for an opinion, and the reader came back suggesting, in all seriousness, that Darwin should drop the species business and write a book about pigeons instead, since everybody was interested in pigeons. The book appeared on the 24th of November, 1859. Its full title was long, in the fashion of the day, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, though almost everyone has always simply called it The Origin. Murray had printed a cautious first run of around 1,250 copies, unsure how so peculiar a book would sell. He need not have worried. The booksellers took the entire printing on the first day it was offered. A second edition was hurried out within weeks. The quiet country naturalist had written a bestseller. What made the book so formidable was not only the idea inside it, but the sheer craft with which Darwin laid it before the reader. He knew perfectly well that he was asking people to accept something that would unsettle them, so he led them toward it gently, step by patient step, beginning somewhere entirely familiar and entirely safe. He opened not with wild creatures in distant jungles, but with the ordinary animals and plants of the English farm and garden. Every Victorian knew that breeders could reshape living things. Farmers bred fatter cattle and woollier sheep. Gardeners coaxed out new varieties of fruit and flowers. Dog breeders had produced from a common wolfish ancestor the entire astonishing spread of dogs, from creatures that fit in a lap to hounds that could pull a man off his feet. And the method was simple. In each generation, you choose the individuals showing the qualities you want, breed only from those, and repeat until the desired form stands in front of you. Darwin called this artificial selection, the deliberate shaping of life by human choice. To make himself a genuine authority, he had taken up the breeding of fancy pigeons at Down House, joining the pigeon clubs of London, raising his own birds, and marvelling at how breeders had turned one ordinary rock pigeon into dozens of wildly different varieties, fanned tails, puffed chests, feathers in impossible places. And then came the turn of the argument. If human beings, working over a few centuries, a few thousand years at most, could reshape living things this dramatically merely by choosing which individuals were allowed to breed, then what might nature achieve, working not over centuries but over millions upon millions of years? In nature there is no chooser, but there is something that does the same work just as thoroughly, the constant struggle for existence that Malthus had pointed to, in which far more creatures are born than the world can possibly keep. In that struggle, nature does the selecting. The individuals whose small differences give them any advantage are the ones more likely to survive and leave young, and to pass those advantages along. Across the vast ages that Lyell's geology had opened up, this slow, automatic sorting could produce changes no breeder ever dreamed of, remaking species entirely, and splitting one ancestral form into many. This was natural selection, and by walking his reader up to it through the farmyard and the pigeon loft, Darwin made something genuinely radical feel almost like plain common sense. He built the rest of the case exactly as you would expect from a man who had spent 20 years accumulating evidence. He explained how isolated populations, like those scattered across his black volcanic islands, would drift apart into separate species. And he drew out the great unifying image of the whole theory, that every living thing is related, branching outward through time from common ancestors, like the limbs of one enormous tree. The sorting of animals and plants into families and orders, he argued, was not a tidy human invention imposed on nature. It was a reflection of real blood relationship, of descent from shared ancestors. The entire sprawling diversity of life could be read as a single connected family, reaching back through unimaginable time to a few simple beginnings. What disarmed many readers was his honesty about the weak places in his own argument. He gave over a whole section of the book to what he plainly called the difficulties, setting out the strongest objections anyone could bring against him and meeting them directly. How could something as intricate as the eye possibly arise by small steps? He admitted the idea seemed absurd on its face, then showed how a series of slightly improved light-sensitive structures, each one useful in itself, could lead by degrees from a simple patch of sensitive cells to a working eye. Why, if species change slowly, does the fossil record not show a smooth chain of intermediate forms? Because the record is hopelessly incomplete, he said, like a book of which only a few torn pages survive. We should not expect to hold every link in our hands. By raising these objections himself, openly and fairly, rather than burying them, he earned the trust of careful readers and quietly removed the sharpest weapons from his opponent's hands before they could pick them up. There was one enormous subject on which he said almost nothing at all, and the silence was entirely deliberate. The most explosive implication of the whole theory was what it meant for us. If all living things had descended from earlier forms by natural selection, then so had we. Mankind was not a separate creature specially made and set above the rest of nature, but another animal shaped by the same blind process as the finch and the barnacle, sharing ancestors with the apes. This was the thought most certain to enrage the devout and to wound the pride of a species that believed itself made in the image of God. Darwin knew it perfectly, and he kept the question almost entirely out of the book, allowing himself a single cautious sentence near the end, a quiet suggestion that his theory would, in time, throw light on the origin of human beings and their history. That was all. He laid the charge and carefully declined to light it, leaving the obvious conclusion for his readers to draw, or to dread, on their own. Historians still debate whether that lone sentence was an act of prudence or a very deliberate provocation. The book did not close with a challenge. It closed with a calm and famous image. He invited the reader to picture a tangled bank of earth, crowded with plants and birds and insects and worms, all so different from one another and all depending on one another, and to reflect that this rich and intricate web, with every bit of its beauty and complication, had been produced not by separate acts of creation, but by the working of a few natural laws across immense time. There was, he suggested, a real grandeur in this view of life, in which, from beginnings so simple, endless forms had arisen and were arising still. It is a serene ending, from a man who knew exactly how fierce the weather was likely to be. And it came. The origin did not slip quietly into the world the way the Linnean paper had done the year before. This time, the idea stood fully laid out, in plain language, in a book that any educated person could buy and read for themselves. And they did, in their thousands. Within weeks it was the talk of the country. Clergymen, scientists, journalists and dinner guests were all arguing about it. The long silence was finally completely over, and the storm Charles Darwin had dreaded and postponed for 20 years broke over his head. The response was loud, divided and immediate. Some readers were thrilled, sensing that a great mystery had at last been prized open. Others were appalled, certain that something sacred had been assaulted. Within months, the book had set off arguments in newspapers, in pulpits, in scientific societies, and across countless dinner tables, and the shy invalid in the quiet house in Kent found himself at the centre of the noisiest controversy of the age. The objections came from two directions at once. The religious ones were the loudest and the most deeply felt. To many devout people, the theory seemed to pull God out of the natural world entirely. If species arose through a blind mechanical struggle, then where was the loving Creator who had shaped each creature with care and purpose? And worse, the unavoidable implication, the one Darwin had so carefully left almost unsaid, was that human beings were not specially made in God's image at all, but descended, like everything else that breathes, from earlier and lower forms, sharing ancestry with the apes. To a society that placed mankind at the very summit of creation, this was intolerable. Placed just below the angels for so long, humanity was now being asked to accept a demotion that felt unbearable, one that seemed to strip human life of its dignity and its purpose in a single stroke. But it was not only the clergy who objected, and that part is often forgotten. There were serious scientific difficulties too, raised by serious and honest men. One came from the new science of physics. The great physicist William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, calculated how long the Earth could have remained warm enough to carry life by working out the rate at which a once molten planet would cool. His answer, some tens of millions of years, was far too short for the unhurried process Darwin's theory required. It appeared to deny him the very ocean of time he needed. Darwin found this objection genuinely troubling, and he had no good answer to it. Neither man could have known that a hidden furnace lay inside the planet, that radioactivity was quietly keeping the Earth warm, and that the world would turn out to be billions of years old, older even than Darwin dared hope. At the time, the physics simply looked like a wall. There was a deeper difficulty still, and this one struck at the heart of everything. His whole idea rested on favourable variations being handed down and accumulated across generations. And nobody in 1859 understood how inheritance actually worked. The common assumption was that the qualities of two parents simply blended in their children, like stirring together two colours of paint. But if that were true, then any new advantage would be halved in every generation, thinned and thinned, until it vanished long before natural selection could carry it through a population. It was a powerful objection, and Darwin wrestled with it for the rest of his life. The answer already existed. At almost exactly that moment, in a monastery garden in Central Europe, an obscure monk named Gregor Mendel was patiently working out the true laws of inheritance among rows of pea plants. But Mendel published in a journal nobody read, and his work sank without a ripple. Darwin never heard of him. The two great halves of the puzzle, evolution and heredity, would not be fitted together until decades after both men were in their graves. Through all the uproar, Darwin himself did almost no public fighting. He was too ill, too retiring, and too genuinely pained by conflict to stand up in a hall and defend himself before a hostile crowd. So he fought from his study, by post, answering critics privately, marshalling evidence, and steering his allies with a careful hand. And he had allies. Around him had gathered a remarkable band of defenders entirely willing to do the public battling on his behalf. The fiercest was a young, brilliant, combative biologist named Thomas Henry Huxley, who had climbed out of poverty on sheer ability, loved an argument, and believed passionately both in the new theory and in the right of science to follow the truth wherever it led, free of religious supervision. He took up Darwin's cause with such relish that he became known, by his own cheerful admission, as Darwin's bulldog. Beside him stood the loyal Hooker, and across the Atlantic the American naturalist Asa Gray, who championed the theory in the United States. The most famous collision of the whole controversy came less than a year after the book appeared, at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, held in Oxford at the end of June 1860. A large crowd packed the room at the University Museum, sensing fireworks. The chief opponent that day was the Bishop of Oxford, Samuel Wilberforce, a powerful, persuasive speaker so famously smooth in manner that he had earned the nickname Soapy Sam. Wilberforce attacked the theory at length, and then, turning to mockery, asked Huxley pointedly whether it was through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed descent from an ape. He clearly believed he had landed something clever. Huxley rose to answer, and his reply passed into legend, though the exact words were never written down, and the accounts differ. The sense of it was this, that he would feel no shame whatever in having an ape somewhere in his ancestry. What would shame him would be kinship with a man who used considerable gifts and a high position to ridicule and obscure serious questions of truth he had not troubled himself to understand. The room erupted. One account has a lady fainting from the shock of it. Others describe uproar and applause. Whether it unfolded quite so theatrically as the story later insisted is doubtful. Hooker, who also spoke that afternoon, was privately convinced that he, not Huxley, had carried the day. But the exchange came to stand as the symbolic moment when the new science stood up to the old authority and declined to be silenced. There was one figure in that Oxford crowd whose presence carries a particular sadness. Robert Fitzroy was there, the captain who, nearly 30 years earlier, had carried a young man with an unpromising nose around the world aboard the Beagle. Fitzroy was older now, still deeply religious, and he was horrified by what his old shipmates' observations had grown into. He is said to have stood up during the meeting holding a Bible above his head, urging the audience to believe in God rather than in man, and declaring how it grieved him that the voyage he had commanded had helped bring such an idea into the world. The man who had almost refused Darwin a berth now wished, in his heart, that he had never let him aboard at all. Fitzroy's later years were unhappy and troubled, and his own story did not end gently, which only deepens the melancholy of that scene. For all the noise of the opposition, though, the tide was already turning, and turning faster than anyone in 1859 would have predicted. The sheer accumulated weight of Darwin's evidence, the tireless campaigning of Huxley and Hooker, and the plain explanatory power of the idea itself won over the scientific world with surprising speed. Within 10 or 15 years, the basic fact of evolution, that all living things share common ancestors and have changed across time, was accepted by most serious scientists. Natural selection as the main engine remained more contested, partly because the problem of heredity was still unsolved, and that particular argument would rumble on for decades. The central claim, though, had won, and Darwin, watching it all from his garden and his study, fretting over every review yet quietly satisfied as acceptance spread, lived to see his dangerous idea travel from scandal into settled science. He had been right to wait. He had been right, at last, to speak. He did not then retire into a quiet old age. He worked steadily and happily for more than 20 years, producing book after book from that same study, and freed from the long secrecy, he could finally follow the thoughts he had once been too careful to publish. The boldest arrived in 1871. In The Descent of Man, he turned directly to the subject he had so scrupulously avoided, and said openly what he had once allowed himself only to hint at, that mankind, like every other living thing, had descended from earlier animal forms and shared ancestry with the apes. In the same book, he developed a second idea he had been nursing for years: sexual selection. The notion that many features of animals, the peacock's absurd and beautiful tail, the bright colours of male birds, evolved not because they aid survival, but because they help their owners win mates and outmaneuver rivals. The following year, he published a study of how humans and animals express emotion through the face and body, full of close observation, including of his own children as babies. Few fathers have watched their infants quite so scientifically, but the image of a grim revolutionary does not fit the real Darwin of those years at all. Much of his time went into patient, delighted experiments in his garden and greenhouse. He spent years on orchids and the ingenious ways they trick insects into carrying their pollen. He studied climbing plants, how they reach and coil and find their hold. He became fascinated by the meat-eating plants, the sundew and the Venus flytrap. testing what would make them close. And his very last book, published in 1881, the year before he died, was a loving study of the earthworm, showing how these overlooked creatures, working silently and endlessly, turn over and enrich the entire soil of a country. To his quiet amusement, the little book about worms sold remarkably well, in its first years better than the Origin had. The man who had unsettled the world found real contentment measuring how much earth a worm could shift in a night. Honours arrived from across Europe and beyond. Societies elected him, foreign governments sent medals, and he became, despite every retiring instinct, one of the most famous men alive. There was one honour he never received, and its absence says everything about the age. His own government never gave him a knighthood, because the religious controversy around his work made the authorities uneasy about appearing to bless it. The most influential British thinker of the century went to his grave as plain Mr. Darwin. On religion he settled, in the end, into a gentle uncertainty. He did not call himself an unbeliever who denied God, and he could no longer accept the Christian faith of his boyhood. The best word for where he stood was one his friend Huxley coined, agnostic, meaning simply that he did not feel he could know. He kept it largely to himself. He never wished to wound anyone's faith, least of all Emma's, and she remained devoted to him to the last, across that gulf they had carried so kindly for 43 years. One false story deserves to be laid to rest here. Years after his death, a tale spread that Darwin had undergone a deathbed conversion and renounced his life's work in his final hours. It is untrue. The family who were with him denied it flatly, and no evidence for it has ever appeared. He died as he had lived, honest about what he did not know. The end came on the 19th of April, 1882, at Down House, the home he had loved for 40 years. His heart, which had troubled him a long while, finally gave out. He was 73, and Emma and his children were close beside him. He had assumed he would be buried quietly in the village churchyard, among ordinary country people, in the place he knew best. His friends had other ideas. They believed a man who had changed human understanding so profoundly deserved a national honour in death, whatever the clergy had made of him in life. A campaign was raised. Scientists and members of Parliament pressed for it, and the result was extraordinary. Charles Darwin, whose theory had so alarmed the religious establishment, was given a grand public funeral in Westminster Abbey, the most sacred church in England, the burial place of kings and queens. On the 26th of April, 1882, he was laid to rest there, close to the grave of Isaac Newton. Among the men carrying his coffin were his old comrades from the long campaign, Hooker and Huxley, and there too, paying his respects, stood Alfred Russel Wallace, the younger man who had once arrived at the same great idea in a fever on the far side of the world, and had handed over the larger share of the glory with such grace. There is a deep irony in that resting place, and it would not have been lost on him. The quiet man who had gently removed the need for a designer from the story of life was honoured, in death, at the very heart of the established church, his unbelief politely set aside in recognition of his greatness. His shadow only lengthened afterwards. For a few decades, the mechanism itself remained in doubt, held back by the unsolved riddle of how traits pass down. Then, early in the 20th century, the forgotten pea plants of an obscure monk were rediscovered, and over the following decades, scientists wove natural selection together with the new science of genetics into one framework. Heredity, it turned out, does not blend traits away at all. It carries them in discrete units, precisely what natural selection had always needed. The two halves of the puzzle, kept apart by an accident of obscurity while both men lived, were joined at last, and Darwin's idea came out of it stronger than he could ever have proved alone. Today, evolution by natural selection is the foundation of all modern biology, the single idea that makes sense of the entire living world, from the smallest microbe to the human mind considering it. It changed not only science, but the way our species understands its own place in things, no longer set apart above creation, but woven into the same immense family tree as everything else that lives. And all of it grew, slowly and patiently, from the work of one quiet, often unwell English gentleman, a boy who lined up beetles on a table, a student who fled the operating theatre, a young man who almost lost his place on a ship over the shape of his nose, a husband who sat for 20 years on the most powerful idea of his century, gathering his evidence, walking his gravel path among the trees, kicking his little stones aside one by one, waiting until he was sure. The boy his father once feared would disgrace the family lies now among the greatest minds his country ever produced. And the world still sees itself differently because he lived. And so we come gently to the end of it. The house in Kent is quiet now. The gardens have gone dark, and out at the edge of the grounds the gravel path lies empty under the trees, still holding the shape of all those slow circuits. The microscope is put away, the notebooks are closed. Somewhere in the soil beneath it all, the worms go on with their patient, unhurried work, as they have for ages, and as they will long after tonight. The old man's long day of thinking is over. There is nothing left to do now but rest. If you are still awake, another quiet story is waiting whenever you want it, and if this one kept you company, a like or a comment is always welcome. But let all of that go for now. There is nothing you need to carry into the dark. Loosen your shoulders. Let your breathing slow and lengthen, the way the water settles in a lagoon inside its ring of coral, on an island that has been quietly sinking for 100,000 years. Let the day fall away behind you, the way a coastline falls away behind a ship. Close your eyes. Everything alive is related, and everything alive is resting somewhere tonight. You are part of that vast and gentle family, and you have done enough for today. Good night. Sleep well.